totally disorganised. There was no authority figure, there was no official figures, there was no police, there was no anybody coming around saying do this or do that or you're at risk.
We heard on the radio on Sunday that there were 500 troops standing by. They're on standby. Big deal. You know, we could have been dead while they're on standby.
A painful post-mortem is underway into the inferno that has burned forever into the nation's consciousness. Tonight's special edition of Four Corners looks at some of the vital lessons to come out of last week's devastating fires. I'm glad you could join us. Most Australians can now smile wryly at the exaggerated reports carried by the international media about the New South Wales bushfires. Australia ablaze from coast to coast, flames licking at the Harbour Bridge, entire suburbs destroyed, Sydney totally evacuated. All pretty ludicrous stuff. But in truth, at the height of the drama, there were moments at least when it seemed just about anything could happen. When the fire chief was saying openly that the fires were completely out of control. When his political master was saying it would be a miracle if only 2,000 or 3,000 houses were lost. When the air was filled with wailing sirens and choking smoke, few people in the region can have felt completely safe. In the end, we counted ourselves extraordinarily lucky to have lost only 4 lives, 150-odd homes, and hundreds of thousands of hectares of bushland. In the end, we were lucky. But the possibilities seared all our imaginations. Can you now feel safe where you live? What would you do if a major fire threatened the neighbourhood? Where would you turn for help? When the flames reached the front gate, would you stay put or flee? Tonight's Four Corners concentrates on just one of the scores of fires that raged the length of New South Wales. We've gone in close on this one tragic black spot in the hope of magnifying a picture vital to all Australians. Ross Coulthard is the reporter.
Like all of Sydney, they'd seen the smoke on the horizon. Everyone knew that somewhere, away from their peaceful suburban homes, a bushfire was raging.
Shortly before midday, a huge fire broke out in the Royal National Park just south of Sydney.
Just let you know we're all okay down here, Evan.
At lunchtime, many turned on their televisions and watched with concern but detachment the scenes of brave firefighters battling with the flames. The reassuring thought in many minds that bushfires burn forests, not suburbs. At 4 o'clock 9 days ago, that changed.
General to all units in the Como area, they've got a fire, it's just gone berserk. We can only do our best, make sure they're safe, but don't tie up airspace. Over.
We're at Janali, about 15 kilometres south of Sydney. We're going up a street in Janali, and I have to report there are dozens and dozens of houses on fire here. You can see them, I think. Many have burnt. We're told that 2 lives have been lost in this area. It's a very sad scene here. One thing I would like to report. This is Janali School.
When it struck, as quickly as it did, obliterating 87 homes, gravely wounding neighbours and taking a mother's life, the folk of Lincoln and Warrenora Crescents, Bindia Street and Soldiers Road couldn't believe what had happened.
It was like a bomb burst. The flames shot up the back of that house there, as you can see by the leaves. It was like a sheet of flames. It was red hot. Blew us back, took your breath away. I went round the back, called to the wife to get the dog out.
We went into the bathroom, and in the bedroom next door, we could just hear the window, You get a glass coming in.
Thinking, oh, well, God, if this is it, I got my wife out of there.
Yeah, it's gone. You know, things like the things that the kids have done when they're in kindy or whatever.
Brand new number plates that hadn't got on the car.
What else have you saved?
Off the restored car, that's it. That was a grandfather's pot plant that I'd carried around, some tools which I bust open and see what's in there, that's all.
Like many Australians, these people chose to live as near as possible to the bush they love. But their streets, straddling the 3 Sydney suburbs of Como, Janali and Bonnet Bay, bore perhaps the worst losses of New South Wales flare-up. These horrible scenes jolted the complacency of many city dwellers living near bush. Until 9 days ago, the fires searing New South Wales forests were a worry. But it took the suffering in these streets to make them a disaster.
Yeah, it's amazing you find you haven't got your toothbrush or your deodorant or you haven't got anything.
We saw it on the news. There's nothing there. We've got a swimming pool and some palm trees. That's it.
It's flat.
It's gone.
The fires here reminded homeowners across Australia that fire is a part of living near the bush. In their wake, it's not just the residents of Janali and Como who want to know how these fires began and what can be done in the future to guard against them. They are questions which can only be answered by tracking back to the very beginnings of the fire.
Why or how this fire has occurred, whether it was from natural or unnatural cause, I can't say. It does seem that this fire has come from nowhere, actually. Looking around to the horizons, there aren't too many places where a spark could have come from a burning fire. But just to repeat, here at Janali, scenes of utter devastation.
As the smoke clears, the fire experts are looking at 2 theories as to the source of the fires that hit Como and Janali. Either the flying embers came from the south, from fires that were unsuccessfully backburnt the day before, or they came from the northwest, from fires which it's suspected were deliberately lit. Whichever it was, what we do know is that the fires surged from here, a few kilometres short of Como and Janali.
This valley of Crown Land bush funneled the fire straight towards Janali and Como, hardly slowed by the minimal amounts of hazard reduction burning done here around some homes. As it tracked towards Bonnet Bay, stunned firefighters watched as embers shot across the river, igniting the other side in less than 6 seconds.
I noticed that fire about 2 minutes ago, and it's gone from a small fire over in that area right up to the top and along there in a space of a couple of minutes.
Just across the valley from Warrenora Crescent, Bonnet Bay local Paul Sheaf narrated what he saw through his video camera lens.
Those houses over there are in a bit of bother. I looked down that direction, and suddenly there was thick black smoke where there hadn't been any a few minutes earlier. That was probably around 4-ish, and it was only within a minute or two after that that I saw flames quite a long way up the valley from that, just virtually straight over the roof of this house below us and just clear of the treetops. Big flames. Within about half a minute, those flames had reached up about 45 degrees to the top of the hill.
I looked back up the street and there was a sheet, a wall, it'd be a couple of stories high, coming up out of the valley and across the street, and it just headed for the houses on the opposite side of the road. It looked like the street itself, the bitumen was alight, and yes, it was just all brazen red and orange, and the heat, it was just immense. And I ran back to Philip and said, look, the fire's right on us, and Philip said, everybody get in the house, and that was only seconds, absolute seconds.
It was like a big, large Bunsen burner blowing up in the air over in that direction and started making its way down, not really flames with it, just brown haze, really powerful heat.
You couldn't see the
This
flames.
is just over the lip of the hill.
Just came up here because we were standing, that was a double-storied house, and we were sitting up the top there inside the house, and the windows were thumping away and the roof was rattling. The wind was very strong and it seemed to be going that way. Then all of a sudden it changed and came back down this way, and I think this is what happened. When it got to here, a wind this way and blew it over here, because there was a 60-foot wall of flame just over that house over there. You can see the top of the trees where it burnt. And mate, it just came straight up.
When the fire hit, there were no firefighters in Como and Janali. For most residents, there were no police and no warning. Bushfire Captain Martin Keeler and his crew were the first fire tender on the scene straight after the blaze had gone through.
It was obvious from just the intense light behind the smoke that there was some phenomenal fire down there. You could feel the heat through the cab, couldn't touch the windscreen or anything like that. It was that hot. And once we allowed things to settle down a little bit, which was probably, seemed like 10 minutes, but I doubt whether it was that long, maybe 2 or 3 minutes, got out of the truck to see what we could do.
The confusion could be heard across the emergency radio.
We need the police at the corner of Walgett and Warrendore Road to evacuate residents, over.
Fire control, Hecat Drill, we cannot find 127 Warrendore Road. All that we can see is just the smoke on the ridge.
Well, we had the line out and it was getting to the stage where we were using more water protecting ourselves from the heat and smoke than what we were able to get onto the houses by using the fog pattern to give a cool effect over us and then swing around with the straight jet onto the houses.
Red, 1081, red. Roger, make yourself safe. Group 3 cannot get to you, over.
General to all units in the Como area, just do the best they can. Don't waste their time. We've got a fire. It's just gone berserk. We can only do our best. Make sure they're safe, but don't tie up airspace. Over.
I think it must have been 5 or 6 minutes we were starting to cough and splutter, and I just said to Jason, that's it, we're out of here. Just dropped the gear and come back to the truck and regrouped with Martin.
They then realised the full horror of what was going on when they heard people were trapped in a house.
A police car pulled up and told us that they had a report of people trapped in their house.
Only a few hundred metres or so around the corner, Richard Dickin and his de facto wife, Paula O'Neill, their daughters, Kylie and Catherine, were fighting for their lives in atrocious heat.
I said to them, we've got to get out of here. We've got the kids, the dogs. We went downstairs, in the garage. I've got the dogs, the kids in the car. Open the garage door, house on fire. The car at the front's on fire. You couldn't get out. I've got everyone back up, upstairs, down low, the towels around their mouths, blah, blah, blah. When the windows went, the house was so smoky, you couldn't see nothing. And they tell you, stay in the house, right? And we did. Got down low, that thing that everyone said, get down low, go, whatever they say. We did that. The windows went. I don't know.
So without the pool, there would be nothing?
The backyard, the whole backyard was on fire. If you had stood in the backyard, you were dead. And when the fireball come through, the house was gone. I just yelled, hit the pool. We hit the pool, and for some unknown reason, the kids just sort of fell into my hands. Don't ask me how. I knew Paula was dead. I watched her fall in the pool. I could hear me dogs screaming and yelling, and in the pool I've got down to the neck height. I've crunched, and I've sat them on my knees, and we've got the towel over our heads, and I've just kept throwing water over the top, and every so often I'd yell, help. I mean, the heat, the smoke, I don't know, the water, I don't know, for some unknown reason, in this towel, and we're talking an area of 3 faces like this, you know, we've told each other how much we loved each other, we've said everything. I mean, I really thought we were going to die.
Incredibly, probably within an hour of the fire's passing, Richard's next-door neighbour, 17-year-old Mark Chaserling, had snuck past police lines to check, believe it or not, on his pet bantam chooks.
Well, we ran out the back just to check our animals, and it was just, the backyard was still on fire, and we just ran up really quickly and then just went as soon as we could. On the way down, we heard the screams from next-door neighbours, because they were stuck in the pool. And we couldn't help them because they didn't have shoes on, and all the bricks that had fallen off our house were just red hot, and our boots were melting. So we had to run and get the help from the fire brigade.
In an action which is likely to earn both men a bravery commendation, Martin Keeler and Phil Walker clambered across the red-hot remains of the house to reach the family.
You feel the heat coming off the walls.
When we came up here, there was the father and the two girls were in that corner of the pool there.
They had a big, like a towel over the top of it. Pink towels wrapped around the top of them, over their heads.
So I think at that stage we both jumped into the pool to see how they were.
What were your feelings as you sat here amidst the heat and all this rubble? I mean, obviously it's the last place anybody would want to be.
Certainly the last place I'd want to be.
Were you amazed that anybody had survived?
To be quite honest, yes.
I took my helmet off, gloves off, and sat them on the edge of the pool over there. Took the mask off and just peeled the mask sort of inside out and just let fresh air, fresh cool air blow onto the girls' faces sort of one at a time. So they had, because I knew their throats and that would have been burnt, to try and get cool air into their lungs. I mean, it wasn't oxygen, it's only breathing air, but it was a lot cooler than the air that was around.
Marty and Phil huddled down in the pool, forced into an agonising wait while an ambulance rescue team struggled to get near the house. In the family's dash through the flames, Paula O'Neill was already too badly burned to survive.
It was like driving into Dante's Inferno. There was fire, there was fire and smoke, there was abandoned houses on the road where fire brigades have had flames come up that close that they've just abandoned their houses on the road and took off.
Ambulance rescue officers Larry Higgs and Keith Williams had a tough time even finding the house amidst the rubble.
Houses looking good one minute and literally exploding from within the next minute. Trees on the side of the road exploding in flame.
So you'd be driving along and a house would explode?
Yeah.
Only when he got to the pool did Larry Higgs realise his son-in-law, Phil Walker, was one of the heroes who'd stayed to try to shield the injured children.
With the intense heat that must have gone through there, I thought, well, nothing possibly could survive.
And how did you feel when you realised your son-in-law was one of the rescue workers helping keep those kids alive?
At the moment, I wasn't particularly interested in them. I was interested in the patients.
Kylie and Catherine remain seriously ill in hospital. It will take a coroner's inquiry to resolve what went wrong. Tearing at this family and everyone who faced the blaze were two competing instincts: to stay at their house or flee.
Good evening, Jeff Raymond with the latest on the bushfires.
After the 1983 Ash Wednesday bushfires, the death toll breakdown in Victoria revealed that out of 46 fatalities, nearly all died out in the open. Only 7 were lost in their homes, and 6 of those were elderly.
Ash Wednesday shows us that most of the people who lost their lives there did so whilst escaping what otherwise may have been a safe haven, and leaving evacuation by their own volition too late or by other agencies too late. The most dangerous of the environments is when the fire is already there. You can't outrun it. It moves faster than you and it's got a damn sight more energy, and you try to escape it. So what we say is that the house, generally speaking, if well prepared, will provide the best source of protection from radiated heat.
But there are qualifications to that maxim. On Lincoln Crescent, Philip Moore had read up on the do's and don'ts of living in a fire hazard area. He was well prepared, and when fires were first apparent, Phil got organised.
We hired a petrol pump to work on the pool so that we wouldn't be dependent on either electricity or water pressure. We filled the wheelbarrow and lots of other containers with water. We had the bath, we had the laundry sink, we had the kitchen sink and all of the other sinks, plus other buckets and things full of water in the house in preparation for fighting the fire again once it had passed. We had wet towels spread around the doors. We had the ventilation strips on top of some of the windows sealed up with tape. We had everything.
Would your family be alive today if you'd followed the book by all the rules?
No, we wouldn't. The children would have because they weren't here, but Barbara, myself, Rob and Kate would have been dead because we stayed in the house. We were waiting for the fire to pass, and the fire didn't pass. It simply stayed. The house started to burn around us. The glass started to explode. When we realised it was time to get out, we came down the stairs, which were just here.
Right.
We crawled on our hands and knees down the stairs. This here was the lounge room. The dining room just here. We were crawling again, trying to get under the smoke. The front door was here, so we came up. We were still crawling.
They made it to safety next door. Phil Moore's careful preparations had saved their lives, but not their home.
That's a tragic result because, I guess for all intents and purposes, they took the advice that's been advocated, but perhaps they weren't able, I'm not going to say wouldn't, but weren't able to react with the follow-up procedure. And the follow-up procedure is leave the house as soon as the main fire's gone, enter what is a very uncomfortable environment, but certainly not a fatal one, and then get about putting out the inevitable fires which have started.
To stay and fight is not the easiest advice to follow, and it's not foolproof because the timing is so critical. But it's the best wisdom drawn from all the recent research.
It is very, very important for the survival of the house that there be people with the house. So we have this very fortunate nexus of people protecting houses and houses protecting people. There's a couple of exceptions to that. If a house is particularly unsuitable, then perhaps one might just have to abandon it to the fates. But if you do that, you must do that many hours beforehand.
David Packham isn't just an academic theorist. He's a veteran fire researcher who practiced what he preaches when he stayed with his own home in Victoria as the Ash Wednesday fires swept through.
I will always be there. And certainly it was by choice. You know, if I went home now and my house had burnt down and all I had is what I have in my hands, the loss of identity, the loss of oneself, the feeling of hopelessness that will go on for quite a long time. People's homes are more than just bricks and mortar. It is part of themselves. And so I think we need to recognise this as well.
You get out, please, folks.
Dad, get down. Please?
New South Wales boasts it has the newest and most elaborate emergency disaster procedures in the country. Unlike Victoria, for example, New South Wales police and firemen have the power to force people to evacuate. And indeed, in the last few weeks, 25,000 people were evacuated across the state.
Forced evacuations lead me to believe that I'm much happier living in Victoria. I think that the facts and the science show, and will show here, I'm quite confident when the studies, if they are done, will show that evacuation is potentially a very good way of increasing life loss in a fire situation. In this situation here, evacuation has worked because the fire has only penetrated the very edge of the suburban area.
However the policy debate on evacuation is resolved in the future, 9 days ago, when the fires hit Como and Janali, the people on the ground didn't know what to do. And the fire was so swift that emergency services got there after the fire hit.
It was totally disorganised. There was absolutely no information, and there was absolutely, like, there was no police, there was no fire people, there was nothing.
Como resident Elizabeth Pemberton saw the fire coming and eventually evacuated herself and her children.
You know, when we left, it wasn't nice and early and everything was fine and dandy. We had to drive out past fire to get out. There was evidence there from Friday night that this was a suburb at risk, and people weren't informed that they were at risk. And when I say that we were a suburb at risk, I mean that fire had licked up to houses at Bonnet Bay. That's only the next suburb.
Thursday and Friday night around this area, even the general public from miles away were expecting it to come because they could watch the fire spreading right across the ridge at Bonnet Bay. And it was burning with a northwesterly bushfire wind, very dry conditions, and all the trees were absorbing the smoke, the carbon. They were perfect. just ready for combustion.
Professional fireman John Benson, off duty at his Warrenora Crescent home, also saw the flames across the valley. He was so certain from that Friday night the fire would hit Como that he alerted a senior fire brigade officer of his concerns at least 4 hours before the fire hit.
It had been announced on television the night before that we were going to have a southerly change, which they described as a welcome relief to bushfire fighters. It was the last thing in the world we wanted. So it was like a brick in the back of the head. You knew that it was going to come. It was just a matter of when. On the Saturday morning around about 11 o'clock, I had to make a move, so I rang District Officer Aubrey Smith, who was in charge of headquarters in the city, to let him know how I felt and that things weren't looking too good.
Although we could see fire across the valley, or not fire, but actual smoke, we assumed that, you know, nobody's given us warning yet, so everything's under control over there.
Do you think that perhaps there could have been more warning?
Oh, certainly. I think that's beyond question.
With uncontrolled fires already raging across the Shire, fine decisions had to be made about where to commit emergency crews.
Unfortunately, most of our resources had been drawn over to Menai and the Alfred's Point area, but had been virtually burnt out. And people tend to become very concerned, and they want to hang on to their resources. They get greedy. They don't want to let them go.
Hotspots flared across several North Sydney suburbs, authorities calling in reinforcements.
In the hours before the Como and Janali disaster, radio and television was saturated with fire stories from across the state. But for residents wanting to find out how bad things were in their streets or suburbs, the information flow was sometimes next to useless. Aware no one out there knew what was going on, in the midst of the Holocaust, John Benson was trying to get a warning out to his fire bosses. The telephones were overloaded, but he saw a police car down the street.
I asked for the use of his radio telephone, the RT set, and without hesitation, he tried and he tried and he tried. He sat there for at least 60 seconds to 90 seconds until I could smell the Jugo in the car burning, and it was time to move. So he let me walk behind the car until he got up to my house, and I stood here and I watched him. By the time he got 2 houses up, his car was on fire, and he went round the corner and put the car out. He's now got to submit a report as to why he damaged the police vehicle.
You're all going to suffer the same withdrawal symptoms as us after this is over?
Yes. The media had been briefed at noon. Bushfire HQ warned of a moderate to high fire threat to a range of areas, including Como, but no other details were given. But this briefing was a waste of time anyway. No residents we've spoken to say they heard that warning broadcast on radio or television.
Were you hearing things on the media about this area?
Not at all, and that's one of the things that we really feel quite neglected and abandoned about, is that we heard lots about Turramurra, lots about Terry Hills, the northern side. We heard that they were being told at least get ready to go, if not being told to go. We knew exactly what was happening up there. You didn't ever hear anything about this area. It wasn't until the disaster had happened that this area really hit the news.
Now we've had a message here that there's a fire at Como near Janali. This is in Soldiers Road. Residents are being evacuated.
Probably the first report on the fire came from a journalist listening to a police scanner at the Regional Fire Control Centre. He tipped off a Sydney radio station. Other stations had also heard the scanner messages.
A church in the area has been damaged. Now that's a fire at Como near Janali, Soldiers Road. They're now currently under evacuation with the flare-up of that fire down the south coast.
In fact, it was commercial radio stations which broke the story of Como, at least 45 minutes before the Bushfire Services media office put out a press release.
I think that we'll find in the fullness of time that there'll be more fires in there when we get around to it.
Theoretically, in an emergency, all official information to the media has to come through here, the New South Wales Bushfire Headquarters.
And if you connect the dots, it's fairly simple to do, you will get an idea of the direction in which that particular fire is burning. So it's burning to the northeast, it's burning to the east, it's burning to the southeast, and also...
But disasters move quickly, and in this case, the fires at Como and Janali happened faster than the ability of the official media information system to report on them.
And how's that backburn there going, linking these two?
Bushfire Commissioner Phil Koperberg admits he was frustrated by how difficult it was to get specific warnings broadcast quickly.
Indeed, on more than one occasion during this particular event, I sought media cooperation for warning a particular section of the community, and that was difficult, despite extensive media cooperation, because there was no mechanism, and that's something we'll be doing.
Without a speedy information bulletin giving detailed official reports on specific streets and suburbs, residents of Como and Janali were often forced to listen to unofficial reports which were sometimes wildly inaccurate or downright speculative.
Here's the latest, although it's an hour or two out of date, but I think you'll find it pretty right. Earlier, somebody said that the roads into Como were open. Our understanding is that that is not so. The roads into Como are not open.
The media didn't get out of their mode of operating of sensationalising and looking for sensational news sufficiently for my way of thinking, that the state was in a state of emergency and people needed information and people in the areas affected needed detailed information. That wasn't forthcoming.
We can't let anyone down there, sorry.
Bullshit! Bullshit!
Mate,
I live there!
Yeah, mate, I'm afraid we can't let anyone down.
To further add to confusion, news reports showed scenes of evacuation, while expert interviews seemed to be contradictory. They advised that people were safer in their houses.
Come on, be real!
Step out of the vehicle.
Be real! No, I've got to get there!
Step over.
From Hobart, 1967, to Ash Wednesday, 83, Andrew Wilson has investigated the deaths in those fires. His study showed there's a greater chance of not losing your house if it's occupied.
Stay near the exits, douse spot fires that occur, and basically it's important that they be ready to move out onto the burnt area after.
Throughout the whole week of crisis, not one official bulletin was broadcast to clarify these confusing messages.
With the benefit of hindsight, we can always say we should have done more here, there or somewhere.
The lesson from the confusion in Como and Janali is that emergency services need a way of getting a message straight to the public without the usual media sieve. They also need a system to gather changing information on fires far quicker than they do at the moment.
We will sit down in cool light of day and analyse what we could have done better, what lessons we've learnt.
Victoria learned the lessons from Ash Wednesday.
When you hear it, stop, listen closely, and do exactly as instructed.
Victorian emergency services now have the power to cut into regular television and radio broadcasts to alert the public to impending disasters. But when Phil Koperberg wanted that same power as fires spread across New South Wales, he was told the best way was to call a news conference.
There is no doubt that a system can be evolved which allows the agency responsible for whatever emergency it might be to transmit quickly to the populace what's happening. This has to be combined, I guess, with a level of community education so that the two can be correlated quite readily so that an association can be formed between the warning which is being expressed and how to react to it.
Como and Janali were just a speck in the overall picture of devastation across New South Wales. On the morning of the disaster to the southeast, most of Australia's oldest national park was a blackened ruin, with the fire front still raging. There were more than 100 fires across the state, including the Blue Mountains west of Sydney and Wiseman's Ferry to the north. But Janali and Como were the worst affected. Of the 155 houses lost across the state, 87 of them came from here, an area which the authorities had not even considered as a high fire risk. While the fires traumatised the state, estimates of their intensity still place them less than the Ash Wednesday fires, and perhaps that accounts for the relatively low toll.
The overall Ash Wednesday situation on the peak of the Ash Wednesday fire, which was during the passage of the front, was probably around about 120 megawatts per metre. So that would be some six times the average intensity of these fires, and probably about 3 times the intensity of the fire in this particular location.
Already, Australia's fire experts are picking over the scene of devastation, starting research which may fill in the blanks. Why, for instance, was Phil Moore's house, which he'd protected so well, levelled, while at the Stanek's house next door, the canvas awning wasn't even scorched?
Certainly these large windows and the combustible decks didn't help. It's the very worst thing you can have at the top of a slope like that, where the fire is going to roar up. How would we classify the shape of the
fire expert Dr. Caird Ramsey has forensically studied scenes like these left by other major fires. According to him, there's nothing capricious in the way fire chooses its victims.
I think people need to understand how houses are ignited and destroyed in bushfires and the means of attack from the bushfire. And perhaps the most important is the burning debris. And here we're talking about burning leaves and twigs and other combustibles.
One feature seems to have been significant in saving the Stanek house. It seems that when the fire roared up the steep slope from behind, this stone retaining wall forced the flames and cinders up and over the house.
We built that wall down there, and the council didn't like it. He said we have to pull it down again, and he put us through the court. He gave us a hell that time, but it wasn't as bad like that fire. But I think that's what saved us.
Set tastefully in the bush, the Moore's house had trees right up to the house and a timber deck to take advantage of the view.
It's really a pity they didn't continue that on in something that was non-combustible rather than putting a timber deck out there. That's almost disappeared. That would have provided a great fuel source for the rest of the house.
Ramsey believes design standards should be made mandatory for houses in high-risk areas. However, even the best designed house can't be saved if it's been built in an inaccessible place. Surrounded by bush, this house was only accessible by a small spiral staircase. Firemen say this makes their job dangerous and difficult. In New South Wales, planning guidelines were changed in 1985, and it's unlikely a new house would be allowed here again. Nor, for that matter, would houses be allowed right next to the bush on a gully side of the ridge without some kind of a fire break. But these suburbs are a legacy of earlier times, and in cities like Sydney, there's hundreds of kilometres of housing backing onto bush, which poses a nightmare for firemen.
Mr. Mayor, one of the things that we've noticed in the valley along here is that there are houses that are built right down in the valley that don't even have vehicle access. Now, do you think that that would be allowed under the 1985 guidelines?
Oh, they certainly wouldn't, and it'd be very unlikely we let them be built there again.
Well, this is one of the problems, isn't it? That the bulk of the houses in your shire were built before 1985.
Yes, that's true, and certainly the bulk of the houses, if not all the houses, that have been lost.
But so strong is the pressure for development that even the council's new zoning regulations can sometimes be overturned in the Land and Environment Court. Here and elsewhere in the state, houses are still going up in very high-risk areas.
I believe that the potential for house loss is increasing steadily all the time. You only have to go around our cities and find how they're spreading out into the bush.
For most Australians, our bush holds a unique attraction. It is fire-prone, but it needn't be our enemy. For 40,000 years, Australia's first settlers managed the land with fire, and the bush adapted to it. If it's burned in the cool months of the year every few years, then fires when they come in summer aren't so fierce. Research has shown that of all the factors intensifying fire risk, the fuel load the bush is carrying is by far the most significant.
When the bushfire experts talk about fuel loads in our bushfire-prone forests, this is what they mean. It's a natural process for many of our trees, particularly eucalypts, to shed bark, leaves and branches. This fuel load builds up on the ground, and its quantity and the intensity of the wind speed affect the strength of fire. Now, the firefighting experts tell us that when the fuel load gets to about 10 tonnes per hectare, it makes a bushfire very hard to fight. Here and in many of Sydney's forests during the blazes, the fuel loads had built up to about 15 to 20 tonnes per hectare.
If there's a low fire intensity around the house, the chance that the house will survive is very high. The things that give you high intensity are high fuel concentrations and steep slopes, and of course those are the things that are there all the time.
The fire that led to Janali and Como came from this Crown land, jointly managed by the New South Wales Fire Brigade and the local bushfire service. In the absence of a hazard reduction plan, these brigades had carried out some hazard reduction work here, although it was hampered by lack of resources. But across the Warrenora River, at the patch of bush below Janali and Como, no one, including the Mayor, can remember any serious hazard reduction work at all.
Has there ever been any hazard reduction in this valley behind you here?
I'm not aware of any in recent times.
You see, residents we've spoken to who've been here 35 years say they've never seen a burn-off.
Well, there may have been, I don't know, that's still to be investigated. I don't know of any.
Does it concern you, though, that your council has been caught napping?
That is another question I think that needs to be examined as to whether this area should have been hazard reduced. It may well be, it is found that hazard reduction would have made no difference.
If you reduce fuels by, and that's what hazard reduction generally means, you reduce the surface fuels, then you will reduce the intensity of the fire. That's straight fire physics.
Phil Cheney is another of Australia's leading fire scientists drawn to Como and Janali in the days following the blaze. His concern is that the lessons of this tragedy will be forgotten. He's seen it all before, a disaster, the public call for change, but in the long run, complacency returns.
I get a little frustrated, but I understand that that's part of the education process, that you have to keep repeating it and repeating it and repeating it.
I imagine that we will repeat what we have done in the past after every disaster. Things have improved a little bit, but in terms of tackling the overall problem thoroughly, we just are almost irresponsible.
Tomorrow's bad, Friday's bad, and Saturday's bloody awful.
The politicians are going to have to balance the emotional public response to the horror of bushfires in suburbia with the fact that such disasters only occur once in a generation.
It's like having a 100-year flood. You know, you can't be prepared every day for a 100-year flood.
But people whose lives have been seared by such events expect total support at the front line.
The individuals did more than was humanly possible. When we left here, there were guys up there on the street who would work themselves to absolute exhaustion. They didn't know what they were doing anymore because they could barely function. Those guys are absolute heroes. It's the coordination. There seemed to be little coordination. We heard on the radio on Sunday that there are 500 troops standing by. They're on standby. Big deal. You know, we could have been dead while they're on standby.
As Janali and Como residents reflect on their ordeal and the experts seek to explain it, many questions remain to be answered by the coronial inquiry. Despite the best of intentions, it's clear that official and media warnings were too late or too confusing to really help. residents and their homes were ill prepared for such a crisis. Their little valley didn't have a bushfire brigade. And no one, including the residents, had organised any worthwhile hazard reduction. The tragedy suffered by the people of Como and Janali is a potent reminder that fire is an ever-present threat to us all. It's a warning we forget at our peril.
Ross Coulthart reporting, and hearing the people of Janali relive their ordeals, you really do wonder that the toll was not far greater in the fires. We were clearly not that well prepared. But it is a fair question to ask just how much sacrifice we should make in terms of expense, in terms of compromising home design and so on, just for the possibility of being caught in a once-in-a-generation disaster. Let's hope it's a generation before there's another one anyway. Thanks for joining me for this special edition of Four Corners. I look forward to your company when Four Corners resumes in February. Good night.